Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. My name is Dean Jones, and I'm the host of the program. This is Season 13, Episode 14. Have you ever craved the homegrown goodness your grandma used to serve? Meet Jennifer Gomes, aka Jenny, mom, wife, teacher, and canning enthusiast extraordinaire. Jenny isn't just passionate about preserving food, it's a way of life. A decade ago, with her first little one on the way, Jenny knew she wanted to share the same delicious home canned experience with her family. Now, canning is woven into her cooking routine, and she loves inspiring others to embrace the joys and simplicity of preserving their own harvest. Jenny co hosts the popular podcast Perfectly Preserved and shares her canning wisdom and love of all things homemade on her blog, The Domestic Wildflower. Join us as we chat with Jenny about the art of preserving, the joy of feeding your family with seasonal bounty, and maybe even a few kitchen mishaps and lessons learned along the way. We'll be also talking about her new book, The Pressure Canning Cookbook. I'm going to take you now to my conversation with Jenny Gomes. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. You may have noticed we've had a little bit of a hiatus, and I want to welcome you back to the podcast. Today, I'm very excited and very happy to be talking with master food preserver, blogger, and now author, Jenny Gomes. And we're also talking about her book coming out in April, Pressure Canning Cookbook. Jenny, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Jenny, for our listeners who are not familiar with your podcast or blog, The Domestic Wildflower, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you grew up?
Thanks. Okay, so I am an English teacher. I'm a wife, a mom of two middle-sized kids, and I grew up and now live at the very tip top of California, in a really rural area in the mountains. And I grew up on a cattle ranch, and I grew up with my mom and my grandmother canning. We had a big garden when I was growing up, and that was my upbringing. And now, as a grown-up, I teach and drive my kids to activities, and I blog. And as you mentioned, I've written a cookbook.
Now, your blog is your blog is no amateur blog. It's very well done and very professional, and it's got some great information in it. It's called The Domestic Wildflower. How did you come to publish this blog? What led for you to create this?
Thank you. I started it because my kids were little, and as a person who likes to write, I needed a little bit of a creative outlet. And uh, that's funny. I have a good friend who said, "You know what, Jenny, I want to build you a blog. You'd love it." And I said, "You're exactly right. I would love it." So she helped me set up my first iteration of the blog, and I just kept blogging. I enjoyed it. It was fun. It was fun to learn about the world of blogging. And um I think for my first 12 months, I published a new blog post every single Monday without fail. And it was, I don't want to say it was effortless, but it was fun to do. And the very first year, I don't think I wrote a single canning post. I just wrote about homemade things, for lack of a better expression. I wrote about all things homemade. And as I wrote more, I also was gaining more experience with canning, and my personal canning practice was growing. And then I started writing about canning quite a bit more on the blog. But that's how it started.
Did that did it cause, I talk to a lot of people who have blogs, and in many cases,
Mm-hmm.
blogs can be a catalyst that causes great change into their life. Did that have that impact on yours?
Well, I don't think, honestly, I blogged and blogged, and one, I didn't have a topic that was especially exciting. I mean, I had devoted blog readers, and I loved writing it, so I kept doing it, but it wasn't making me mountains of money the way
Yeah,
some blog topics did at that time.
yeah.
And I kind of missed the boat. Like, had I started maybe 5 years before that, if I might have caught the wave of early blog success. So I just mostly blogged for myself. And then as I grew in my expertise and took the Master Food Preserver course and, got on Instagram, the progression of blogging progressed. I met my now dear friend and podcast co-host online, and then she invited me to her state to take the master food preserver course. So it did lead, but it did take a little while to that life change. But it certainly wasn't immediate.
Yeah, you mentioned your podcast, Perfectly Preserved, which you do with Anna Cash.
Right.
How did you come up with the podcast with her? What kind of got you guys to kind of decide to create it?
Yeah. So she and I met on Instagram. We just were both posting about canning, and I'm, the algorithm, for all of its drawbacks, put us in each other's feeds, and we messaged back and forth. And at the time, I had been looking for several years for this is pre 2020, a couple years before 2020. I had been looking for a master food preserver course, which is offered by states' cooperative extension offices,
Yeah,
which are in tandem with the university systems. And my state did not have one anywhere near me. And over the border in Oregon, they weren't willing to take an out of state attendee, which is a crazy story. So I just started talking with Anna Cash on social media. And then she said, well, come to Utah. She lives in Ogden, Utah. They welcomed me with open arms, didn't care that I was from out of state. And I went and stayed at her house for a week in 2021 and took the master preserver course there with in her hometown, or the town in which she lives.
yeah. So for some perspective, from what I know of the different UC extensions and stuff like that, your nearest one would be 5 hours away. So Utah would be much closer, wouldn't it?
Well, I still it was a longer drive to Utah from where I am, but
Mhm.
the robust cooperative extension food department that they offer made it worth the trip. And I wasn't the only person who traveled to be there, just coincidentally. There
Yeah,
were people from New Mexico, people from Colorado. They all flew. So where I live, there is a cooperative extension office, but they don't have a food department. They help farmers
right.
manage invasive weeds, and they do other really important things, but they don't have a robust food department.
Yeah,
But
that's too bad.
that is how I met Anna, and that is how we became friends. And then um, it had been in my mind that I thought I would, I love to chat, I love to talk to people, I love to teach. I thought a podcast would be a really fun endeavor, and I didn't want to try it alone. And she's a person that I could talk about food preservation with no end in sight. And I asked her, and she said immediately yes. And we brainstormed 100 topic ideas without any trouble at all. And that was over a year and a half ago, I think we started.
Now, I grew up, I'm no stranger to a mason jar. I grew up around my grandmother's canning and my other grandmother canned. And I
Mm-hmm.
grew up around things as like canned leather breeches beans with a bit of fat porks floating in it, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
chow chow and homemade preserve. I would live for my grandmother's homemade preserve. She made her own, she grew Concord, or what were called scuppernong grapes.
Yes.
And
Yes.
she grew those in San Diego. And she had like these what were horrible looking vines in the winter, but in spring would be gorgeous.
Yes.
Uh, these vines, and she would make it. We would just float on the air on the scent of the grape jelly being made. And
So
go ahead.
this is such a canner who's also with an English teacher reference, but it is the Scuppernong grape that's mentioned in To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh
There's a
wow, I forgot about that. Yeah,
the Scuppernong arbor. And
yeah,
when I taught To Kill a Mockingbird, I would spent probably too much time explaining this is a grape that's a lot like the Concord grapes we have here. It's like a
yeah.
larger grape, right? A little bit larger than the Concord, I believe.
Yeah, you can't just they're a little bit larger, and you can't just eat them. I mean,
Right,
you
right.
could, but like there's a
The skin's a little
conceivable.
thicker.
Yeah, it's
There's
very thick
seeds.
skin.
Yeah.
The seeds not like not nothing. So
Yeah.
yeah, you don't want to, not something you heartily eat. I mean, you could, but like it definitely makes good jelly, but not eating out of hand.
Yeah. And they have such a grapey scent. It's incredible.
It's the best smell in the world. If I could
Yeah.
bottle that and smell it every day, it'd just be like heaven. It's just the best.
That's what I love. Canning has so many happy, nostalgic memories for people. It's the
What about you though?
happiest thing. Oh, what about me? I mean, my grandmother and my
Mhm.
mom preserved a lot of fruit from our family ranch. My very industrious great-grandmother was sure to plant a variety of fruit trees on the ranch. So we had apricots, Concord grapes, pear, cherry, peach, and then wild blackberries down by the river. So those were the fruit products that we canned the most of. Um, and that was the types of recipes. Oh, and apples. I hope I didn't skip apples. Um, so that was the thing that I really cut my teeth on when I learned to can was I was pregnant with my first daughter, and I probably should have just focused on painting the nursery like a like a normal person would. Uh, but I made probably 100 jars of applesauce that winter because I was thinking this baby is going to need applesauce to eat, which was obviously a
Smart.
whole year early. I didn't have to do that right then when I was pregnant, but I learned a lot, and that was my first winter really canning a lot of jars of anything as a grown up.
Can you briefly, for people that are not familiar with it, what is the science behind the food preservation process through canning?
Sure. So I like to say that the canning process creates an atmosphere inside the canning jar that's metaphorically, not literally, like Mars, in so much that it's inhospitable to spoilers. So you achieve that by choosing recipes that have been tested, and after you create this recipe of jam or applesauce or beef stew, you heat it using either a water bath canner, like you remember your grandmother using the black
Yeah.
speckled pot,
Yep.
or using a pressure canner so that it gets hot enough to kill any spoilers that might be present. If you're using a fruit or pickle high acid recipe, it's appropriate to use a water bath canner because it can rely on acid to also do some of the killing of the spoilers to create that atmosphere inside the jar that's not welcoming to any spoilers.
Yeah.
If you have a low acid recipe like meat or beans or plain vegetables, then you need the heat of a pressure canner to get over 240 degrees, which will kill any spoiler present.
Now, I want to. My grandmother had a canning pressure cooker
Mm-hmm.
that she used, but that
Mm-hmm.
was back in the day. And I
Yep.
remember we all would go outside and like get as far from the house as possible when she was canning because it sounded
Mm-hmm.
terrifying. I imagine
Right.
pressure canners are better nowadays.
Pressure canners are better nowadays, and they have actually a lot of safety features that help a canner understand what's happening inside because it's all opaque. There's no window inside, you can't
Yeah.
see. So I think that adds a little bit to the fear factor because you can't see inside. But there are several new types of safety features on a new pressure canner. Um, my podcast co-host Anna, she's a thrifting queen. I don't have the thrifting resources where I live the way she does, but boy, she is good. She has given our listeners lots of great tips that I'll share with you now for thrifting a pressure canner. And it can be done, but the tricky part is you don't want one that's so old that you can't get a user manual for, which
Oh
is
yeah.
unfortunately that's what you will find at the Goodwill is really, really old ones. Or you can find ones that have never been used that just sat in someone's garage. Someone aspirationally bought it and never used it. But it is most important when choosing a pressure canner that you refer to an appropriate manual. And if you've lost your manual, you can print it off of the manufacturer's website. And if you can't get a manual, then you probably shouldn't use it.
Now I've read many different types of cookbook that talk
Mm-hmm.
about canning, and sometimes the differences are jarring.
Mm.
Pun unintended. But I've seen the ones I see the most often, especially the British ones, are they just
Oh.
basically pour the stuff into the jar, put some paraffin on top, and put
Mm-hmm.
the lid on, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I've never wanted to really venture there. It just doesn't seem right to me. And then I
Sure.
know there's like there's just regular canning. I guess I don't know what the term is, but like when I do jam and stuff, I just boil it in
Uh-huh.
a big kettle and then let it, I use the prescribed times usually
Yep.
in like the cookbooks, and then I just take it out and let it, and usually you hear that satisfying pop later on.
Yep. Yes.
And then there's
So,
the canning kind. And then you and I talked a little earlier about some of the
mhm.
other weird methods like oven canning and stuff.
Sure.
What are the
Yeah.
different types?
So I think that it's important once you understand that acid is the one of the keystone factors that make canning work. Um, when you hear people say like, "Oh, so and so in England," or "my grandmother," or whomever, uses an oven for canning, or uses a dishwasher for canning, or uses it's called the upside down method, where they just pour it into the jar and then turn it upside down.
Yeah.
When they get a seal on the jar and they've canned, let's say, strawberry jam, which is naturally very high in acid, the worst thing that could happen is that the seal will fail. The lid has a weak or false or unreliable seal. And you will not suffer some grave consequence like succumbing to botulism because of that acid. The acid makes that environment inside that jar inhospitable to any bot toxin that might develop. That said, I think like my philosophy with canning is that if you're going to bother to preserve it in a jar, go through the time and the effort of doing that, you should follow a method that will give you the best seal, that will last the longest, that will keep your jam beautiful and mold free for as long as possible. So I listed some of the ways that people do it. They also can call it open kettle canning, where you don't like submerge it in boiling water. Um, but the reason that people can do those methods, and usually, I mean, they aren't going to get sick. They will probably just have food spoilage, but they can get away with it because they're canning fruit and other high acid recipes that way. And that's why I'm sure you've heard like, oh, my grandmother always did the paraffin, or my grandmother did whatever. Well, that's great. And I'm so glad that no one ever got sick. But what probably did happen is those seals didn't last as long.
No, I doubt it. They're probably like, a couple months maybe if
Sure,
you're lucky.
and that's okay. I mean, I'm not here to bash on anyone's grandma,
Yeah.
but that is probably why that never resulted in some terrible consequence.
Now, so I have a question, and
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but every time I make specifically peach or apricot jam, and I put as
Uh,
much acid in it as I can, I get this
mm-hmm.
black mold on top, and it drives me insane because I'm
Really?
I'm like really trying as hard as I can to get a really good seal and to put extra acid in, and just I just don't know what I'm doing. But every time I do it, so and I'm not necessarily asking this to ask that question, but mainly what I want to ask is what are some of the common mistakes that people make when they're doing
Oh,
canning?
well, there's a handful. And we can use your example, your situation as an example. Um, while I'm not sure exactly why that's happening to you, I would say that one thing I didn't know was, or I didn't really think about it from the right perspective with jam making. So if you want to make jam with something that is naturally low in pectin, like a peach, and you were a new or beginner jam maker, I think the smartest way that you could go is that you would pick up a box of pectin at your local grocery store and you would use the recipe on the box,
Yeah,
because those recipes have been developed to give you the best possible set. And I think that sometimes we try to use, like, we want to use grandma's recipe and then we buy whatever pectin is at the store. And it
yeah,
should be flip flopped. I mean, the proportions are going to be pretty close to the same, but what you want to do is follow the recipe on the box because that is going to give you the best result. So
yeah,
that's one thing. And then two, you said peaches and apricots. Both of those are naturally lower in pectin. So if you are adding extra citric acid, I see that you're trying to you're trying to prevent the food from molding. But what
yeah.
might be happening is you're throwing off the balance of calcium, which is another
Oh,
part of the pectin's chemical reaction. And I'm not a food scientist. I only have a degree in English. So be gentle on me, listeners, if you do have a food science degree. I might be misquoting that a tiny bit, but I think that that would be my best guess, is that by attempting to give it more citric acid, you might be throwing off that balance. Um,
that makes sense.
so I would guess that's what's going on in your particular situation. But but that goes back to it's just a good idea, especially if you're new to canning. I would just go by the box, just do exactly as the box says and the box's quantities, and just follow that recipe and see if you don't get a better result.
Do you have a recommended like go-to canning method, or do you use different types?
So I live 3,000 feet above sea level in the mountains, and uh, that is a little bit of a ways up, but not so high up that that my canning times, they're not extended it's so that they're really, really long, right? So I have to add 15 minutes to every processing time because of my elevation. That said, um, I think I'm just low enough in the universe to use steam canning for any water bath canning recipe. And an atmospheric steam canner is not a pressure canner. It looks a lot like a metal cake dome, I guess. It's
Yeah.
just aluminum. It has a little dial on top, and they boil water a lot faster because the bottom of the pan is only 2 or 3 inches tall, 3 inches tall probably. So you're bringing to boil a lot smaller quantity of water. And
Oh,
I
wow.
find it very useful because if you're canning a subsequent batch, you don't have to wait for that pot of water to come back up to boil. It's really a time savings. But I mentioned the altitude because they have a maximum process runtime of 45 minutes. So if you lived at Leadville, Colorado, or you were canning tomatoes, which have a long process time in Utah, like 4,500 feet, like my canning partner, my podcast partner, Anna, it might not be the device for you. But if you're a sea level canner, they are so great. They're called an atmospheric steam canner. Love them. You can get them on Amazon. So for water bath canning recipes, I use that almost exclusively. But as I grew in my canning expertise and became more confident, I started pressure canning more and more. And that is the method that it just really rounds out your preserving practice. It just opens up a lot more meal planning capability. Um, and you could just can a lot with it. It really, really helps, I think, in terms of just stocking your pantry with delicious things you want to grab and throw together for a quick dinner or take for lunch or eat on the go.
Do you think there's a lot of like people that just kind of like they have a few successful canning
Mm,
maybe they make a few like strawberry preserves and something
yeah.
else, and they figure, I know everything I need to know. I don't. Then they just like wing it. How important do you think it is to stick to the
Oh,
recipes that are out there?
well, it's interesting too because you describe one group of canners, right, who do it a couple
Hmm.
times and think, I need no further information. And then there's some that are so afraid to try that they're missing out. They're missing
Yeah.
out on the satisfaction and enjoyment and the experience. So there's the two sides of the pendulum's arc there. Um, it's very important to follow testing canning practices. And I know that sounds super boring and regimented, but canning science is really old and very well tested. And it mostly is just comprised of um, cooperative extension offices who test the temperature inside the middle of your canning jars, of those canning jars of stew or soup or tomato juice or jam, to make sure that it gets hot enough inside for that particular recipe to kill any spoilers that might be present. So when we say tested recipe, that's usually what we mean. It's been tested by a cooperative extension office or another respected um, organization to make sure that when processed as directed, you don't have any issues with food spoilage or foodborne illness. So I think it's very important.
Anybody who's done some canning has had times when they look in their pantry and what they put into the can no longer resembles what they
Yeah.
initially put in the can,
Yeah.
and stuff will change. Weird things will happen. Things that will have no explanation will
Hmm.
happen. What are some ways we could tell if something's spoiled or not in the can?
Great question. So one thing I've learned is when I was growing up, we never did this. And I realize now why you should. remove the rings from your jars after they've been canned, after they've cooled, you're labeling them and you're putting them on the pantry shelf or wherever they're stored. If you remove the ring and set them on the shelf, you're much more likely to see if the seal fails because it will visibly be lifted. It will lift up.
Oh, yeah.
And I struggled with changing that habit when I first started canning because my mom always left the ring on, right? Because it
Yeah.
seems like you should have the ring on to keep it tight, right? It's like an idea
Right.
of like keeping the lid on tight. You
Yeah.
don't need that and you don't want that. Your lid, if you properly can something, will be so tight you can pick it up with your fingers on the edge of the jar with no ring and it's sealed that tight. So one step
Ah,
that everyone can take is to remove the rings from their canned items, no matter how they were canned, so that you can see. And then as soon as oxygen is introduced, very quickly you'll have mold, you'll have some sort of like a slow moving lava flow, you'll have something that will visually give you a clue, or it'll smell terrible. So if either of those things happen, absolutely do not eat. Um, if you believe that you have low acid food, so plain vegetables, meat, beans, those types of foods, if you believe or just do not know how it was preserved, let's say someone gave it to you, like I don't know, a coworker or some family member you couldn't ask without offending. Um, if you're not sure how it's preserved, you can hard boil for 10 minutes, and that process is enough to kill any botulism that could be present. So it's not often, but it's occasional that people receive canned items and they don't know, like, oh, I don't know if this was canned properly or not. And they don't want to waste or whatever. You can just you dump it into a saucepan and hard boil for 10 minutes. And then it would be safe to eat, no matter how it was preserved.
that's good to know. Thank you
It
for
is.
that.
It is. Yeah, I get a lot of questions with people saying, like, so and so canned this for me. How do I know if I can eat it? And that's usually what I say.
Now, there's nothing that has its own, like anybody who starts getting into canning, you find there's a lot of things that are really just particular to canning only.
Mm.
Can you talk about some of the things, the accoutrement of canning, so to speak?
Oh, so the specific tools, the tools of the trade. I think that you could really go hog wild and spend a lot of money finding a beautiful copper jam pan. And if you do enjoy it, that's wonderful. You should do it. But I think the most important tools are that you have a good ladle, that you have a new set of canning lid if you're using a standard regular mason jar style of canning jar. So don't reuse your lids. Um, you need a canning pot if you're water bath canning, and if you're pressure canning, you need a pressure canner. And if you are using used jars, which is very, very common, just check those jars for cracks or chips before you begin. And I think I mean, there's not a whole lot that you need beyond that, really,
Yeah.
beyond what a normal cook would have in their kitchen. A
What do you
funnel. I
think?
think I meant to mention, let me interrupt you again. Sorry. I
You're
forgot to
good.
mention that a funnel is really helpful, especially in keeping food off of the top edge of the jar, which is really important for seal formation. You don't want to have any little drips of jam on the top of your canning jar because that will inhibit the seal from forming. So a funnel helps you avoid that.
Do you have any personal anecdotes or experiences that kind of highlight the importance of safe canning practices or just following a recipe, really, even?
Sure. I have two that I thought of, so I'll try to be brief. So one time I was canning a fruit, I think it was like a pineapple salsa. So salsas can be tricky because they have a lot of low acid ingredients mixed in with high acid ingredients, and they are processed in a water bath canner. So it's really important that you don't forget to add the required acidifying ingredient, which in this recipe, I think was citric acid. And I canned one batch and realized, or one, nine, let's say 9 pints of it, and I realized, oh no, I didn't put any citric acid in these. So what I did was I saved one jar and marked it with a big X, put it way up high on the shelf, and I wanted to see what would happen. And it created a grotesque lava flow of mold. So that
Ooh.
was one time that I goofed and I knew what to do right away, which was all the rest of it I just reprocessed and just opened up all the jars, put it back in the pot, added my citric acid, and then just reprocessed, recanned it all. But I saved one jar to see what would happen, and it was quite the illustration. And then with pressure canning, the vast majority of the things that I hear people do, it's almost always people opening the lid before the pressure canner has cooled off after the pressure canning process is completed.
Oh
So
no.
if you read the directions, it's very clear in every pressure canning manual I've ever seen. Do not open the lid until there's certain safety features that are on the lid that show you visually, oh, that the pressure it's still pressurized inside. Do not open, do not open. And yet people think, it's probably okay, or they're in a hurry or complacent. And the vast majority of scary stories I've heard have all been related to opening it before it was cool. So when I get done with a pressure canning project, I just turn the heat off and walk away. You can leave the house. If it's off of heat, you can come back in 2 hours. There's nothing that should compel you to hurry and get it out of the pot. There's no hurry.
I want to talk with you about your new book. You have a book coming out in April, and it's called The Pressure Canning Cookbook. I wanted to be really clear with the listeners, and I think I talked to you about this a bit, is that this is no simple book on canning. This is a comprehensive, weighty, real tome on pressure canning, and it's got a lot of information in there. I mean, I imagine I want to ask about the length of time it took you to write this, because there's a lot of really intense writing there. But also, like for me, like somebody who's seen a lot of canning, I feel like there's a lot of art to it too. You were creating food that really was something that you'd want to eat also. Can we talk about this book a little bit, how you came to write it, the length of time, and what you kind of wanted to put into it when you wrote it?
That's so kind. For my book to be referred to as a tome, I mean, that's my what a compliment. Thank you. Um, it took the bulk of 1 year to write. Um, and the way I the one of the most fun parts was thinking, okay, what kind of recipes would help me as a mom of two kids? My husband works. I think a very busy, normal family. I mean, everybody's busy. What would help me to have canned, ready to go on the pantry shelf? So what I did was I sat down with my most loved cookbooks, a big stack of them, and a stack of Post-it notes, and I went through and thought, what recipes do I cook already that would be delicious canned? So I marked those, and then I had to go back and cross-reference with the ingredients and times and the size of the meat chunks. I had to go back through and cross-reference to what is tested by cooperative extension offices and make sure that I created a recipe that would be tested. It'd be the same size of jar, the same size of pieces, the same ratio of types of ingredients, but just in a mixture that was delicious and seasoned in a way that I thought was really good. So the planning part was really fun. And then when I was actually canning and writing the recipes, I would make a double batch, and half of it I would can, and the rest my family would eat for dinner, because like I said, I'm just a normal mom. I don't have a team of people helping me do this. I don't have a professional kitchen. Um, so it became like 3 times a week I would do this. I was making a big dinner first thing in the morning after I took my kids to school, and then I would can half of it, and then I would test it after it had been canned in a few days to see, how delicious it was, or what the result was. But that is how I did it. I just had to make it be like mom making dinner, but just lots of it and canning it all. Um, and the writing part did take a long time, uh, only probably because I've never written a cookbook, and it's just so important that the direction, style, and the way that the canning is explained has to be super, super clear. And that was the thing I thought I could bring to the canning world was excellent, very clear instructions for a beginner. I hope that that is my contribution to canning, is that it's really easy to understand and the steps are very clear.
I think you did that very well. I mean, there's really no stone left unturned here. And the book almost, I would even, I would go as far as saying you could probably use this as a textbook in a class if you were teaching canning.
Oh, what a kind compliment. Thank you. I hope so.
Yeah.
That was my goal. That was really what I thought. I didn't get hung up with like, oh, there's already canning books out there. I mean, yeah, I know. But that didn't deter me, because I thought the thing that I will bring is I will bring delicious recipes that a person would want to serve their family for supper, and it will be very easy to understand.
Well, I mean, I think that's something you bring up an interesting point because there are lots of canning books, but like I'm not going to name the name. And there's a cookbook I read recently for canning, and I think that the person had inventive recipes that were very
Mm-hmm.
clever and inventive. I would not use the canning procedures that they outlined because they did not seem safe.
Oh.
And I think it's
Huh.
one thing to be a cook. You could be good at cooking,
Sure.
but I think that if you're not following the science, that doesn't necessarily translate well in the canning process.
Well, it doesn't translate well, you're right. I think that the thing that I learned too is that uh when I was connected with my publisher, and I have an editor there and I had a private editor, and there's just not a lot of people that know a whole lot about canning. So my editor was just vaguely familiar with canning, and if I had given her a recipe that was totally unsafe for canning, she would never have known. In fact, they were asking me at the onset, can you include recipes that that definitely had milk included, for example. And dairy is a food item that is not currently tested to be safe in canning. So none of my recipes have that. They have no cream. Sorry,
Yeah.
you have to add the cream to the potato soup after you've heated it up. So they, I think there's just a general lack of knowledge. And like you say, you can be a great cook, and that doesn't mean that the recipes would be safe to be preserved, which is unfortunate.
The design is nice too in this book. It looks really good. Did you have any input on that when you were producing the book? Did you have a look that you wanted to have?
Well, I was tasked with the photography, and I am not a food photographer, so I employed the best food photographer I knew. Her name is Della Hayden of Circle Bar Photography, and many years ago she was my babysitter, and she grew up to become an incredible photographer. And
That's wonderful.
so her style was one that I liked and I knew would be really beautiful. And we talked about this before we hit record, but canned food can be not as beautiful as freshly cooked food. So that
Right.
was actually something I really worried about, was how are we going to make canned meat, for example, look pretty, or canned chili or beans. We make that look appetizing? And I'm grateful for a good food photographer, because I certainly am not one.
No, I've known lots of hunters that can their own meat, and oftentimes it looks like something out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it just
Yeah, it's pretty ugly. Yeah.
they're like, "You want to take
I
home some venison?" And I'm like, "No, I don't. No, I'm good."
Yeah, it's really hard. I think in the food blogger circle, I remember reading lots of jokes about how do you make beef stroganoff look good. And you don't can beef stroganoff, but that's the same idea. It's brown and gray is not particularly beautiful. Um, so I did have to work pretty hard on that in terms of thinking. I thought from the very beginning, how will this look plated? I had to think like that.
When it works well, and canning, it's all there's so many beautiful things you can do, and it makes such good gifts and stuff. Have you ever
Mhm.
had any personal satisfaction as a canner that you kind of like watching your family eat it, or watching somebody, take a gift they later raved about? Do you have any stories of personal satisfaction from canning that you want to share?
I mean, I think that my story of satisfaction can be had by anyone who does it, because it isn't very difficult to do.
Hmm.
And it can be so very quickly so satisfying. I think that one thing that I did early on in my canning journey when my kids were really small, I remember as a mom, I had felt kind of isolated. You know, you're stuck at home and tied to nap time, and your friend group isn't, it's not that they're different, but they're a little bit different because you don't get to see your pals anymore. And I invited one of my dearest friends over to can tomato sauce, and we did it together. And while we're peeling tomatoes and we're canning, doing all the process, we're getting caught up, we're having a cold drink, and then she gets to leave with half of it. And it was so fun that we were able to connect in that way. It felt like we were getting something done. And you get to leave with amazing tomato sauce. I think that's the gift I want everyone who reads my book to have is the idea that you can invite a friend, have a pal come over, invite a stranger, make a friend on a Facebook group, and doing it together. That sense of community and togetherness is one that I just wish for everyone, because anytime I've ever canned with someone in person, you make a new friend or add a layer to your friendship. Now I have many canning friends, like, hey, you want to go pick blackberries together? Or hey, do you want to make bone broth? And we'll do it together at so-and-so's house. Or doing things together takes the burden or any uncertainty and helps mitigate that. You got two heads, which are better than one. And it can just lighten the burden of cutting up all the meat or measuring the ingredients. It can just be a fun together thing. And I think that is the gift I want to give to the canning world, even beyond, taking a friend who really needs, dinner made some tomato sauce. Those individual instances are many, but the greater gift, I think, is just teaching people that you can do this in duos and trios in your home or just with friends.
The pressure canning cookbook is going to be out in April, which is coming up quick. How does
Yeah.
it feel to be, this is your freshman effort? What's it like for you right now?
You know, to be honest, I didn't tell anybody that I was even writing the book for a long time. And it wasn't that I doubted myself. I think I just thought, well, maybe something will happen. And like they'll say, actually, never mind. We aren't going to publish this book. And it
Well,
wasn't
that
like a
does
lack
happen
of,
though, so you're kind of smart.
yeah, I
I've
mean,
heard horror stories.
yeah. I didn't tell, I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anybody for a long time. My husband knew, the kids knew, because we're eating a lot of great things, every night that we normally, some nights I normally would make grilled cheese. But I didn't tell people for a long time because I felt like, well, maybe it won't pan out. But now that it looks like it's going to pan out, it looks like it's going to work out. I just feel excited, and I feel like uh it's kind of like having, I don't know how to describe it. It's a wild feeling. It feels really happy, and I feel proud, and I know I did a good job. I worked very hard on the editing. My goodness, that was a lot of editing. Um, I feel proud of it, and I feel excited, and I think canning is great. Like, I want every family in America to just be able to can, even if they don't can all the time. I think it's unfortunate that it was lost from the general knowledge, because it can be so helpful and such a time saver. I hope that this book is a contribution that helps people learn how to do it in a way that is not as scary, not as difficult, not as cumbersome. So just makes their lives easier. They can just grab a jar of something off the shelf and take it to lunch. That's what I want for the world and for this book.
So now that you've finished this book, what's next for you?
It's a great question. I ha I want to keep sharing canning. I want to keep podcasting on my podcast, Perfectly Preserved. I just want to continue sharing canning. I guess I would write a second book. It wasn't easy to do, but I would love to write a second. I also have a little bit of a writing bug for fiction, and maybe that will result in more books for fiction readers as well. Um, I won't share too much about it, but I have a protagonist that uses her knowledge about canning to solve murder mysteries. So
Ooh, I like that.
that is also on the horizon. But yeah, I just want to keep sharing ways to make canning easy for people.
That's wonderful. Now, Jenny, we're going to have a link to people to purchase the book in the bio. So when they listen to this today, they'll be able to access that and maybe pre-purchase it. Is that possible?
Yes, it's available for pre-order now, and I shared with you a visual guide. So for your listeners, if you'd like to make that available to them, there's
Oh, well.
a beautiful PDF that gives you the equipment that you need to get started, the process for pressure canning, and the types of foods that are appropriate for pressure canning. So you can kind of wet your whistle, so to speak, if you pre-order and are waiting for the book to arrive.
Well, Jenny, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I've really loved getting a chance to talk to you, and I'm really excited about everybody getting a chance to read this book. And I also want to recommend that people look at your blog. We're going to have links to that in the bio as well. And we're also going to have links to the podcast also, so they can listen to that. It's a really great podcast. Perfectly Preserved is very well done. And the conversations between you and your co-anchor, Anna Cash, are really wonderful. I highly recommend it. Very
Oh,
well done. I think it's a classic example of an excellent podcast.
oh, you've been so kind. Thank you so much for having me on.
Jenny, thank you for being here. I really wish you well, and I want to wish you success on the book, but I think it's not going to need it. I think I smell a bestseller here, so I think you're going to do really well.
That's so, so kind of you. I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was my conversation with Jenny Gomes. We are going to have links to her new book, Perfectly Preserved, on the bio. You can link to the bio and pre-purchase it. You're going to want to, because it's going to be a very popular book, and I think it's going to sell out pretty quickly. We're also going to have links to her podcast, Perfectly Preserved. You're going to want to listen to that as well. It's an excellent podcast, and I highly recommend it, as well as her blog, The Domestic Wildflower. Check those out in the bio. Until next week, I hope you all have a really wonderful week and you stay warm. Until next week, I'll see you at the library.